just a bit of a financial regulatory sort of update. So in terms of the things I'm going to cover is just key themes coming out of the ESFA's assurance outcomes. So what the ESFA do is from last year's audit regularity accounts, they do loads of statistics. Just going to highlight a couple of key themes that have come out of that. Talk about this year's accounts direction and some of the key changes that you just need to be aware of as obviously heading into the year end. Around trustees report, the financial statements. What might be in the 24 handbook, it hasn't been released yet. Not really sure when that's going to be released, so I'm trying to have a little bit of a guess as to what maybe some of the changes might be in there. And I haven't got any inside knowledge, I haven't seen a copy or a draft of it or anything like that. It really is a little bit of a guess. And then just a couple of other, I call them good to know updates. So first of all is just in terms of the ESFA's assurance outcomes. So this is based on the audited accounts that were submitted last year. So the 99% is that 99% of trusts had unqualified audit reports. So that means essentially a clean bill of health. So, and that's fairly consistent with the previous year. So, a good positive that 99% of trusts, auditors' reports are basically saying it's a clean opinion. Of that 99%, there were about 10% that are still effectively a clean opinion, an unmodified opinion, but the auditors do raise a few issues in them. So they say we give a clean opinion, but we are just emphasising a particular thing. So it's called a kind of like an emphasis of matter. It's still a clean opinion, but we're just drawing the reader's attention to something specific in there. So that other 10%, about 1% of them, was to do with going concern. So basically, we were saying that this trust is actually no longer a going concern. It has financial issues, potentially low reserves, no reserves, facing future deficits, already in deficit. So that's a real going concern emphasis on that point. It's not a qualified report, it's just raising that issue. Around about 2% were emphasis on matters reports in terms of other issues, but most of those were to do with local government pension scheme valuations. Lack of valuations, not agreeing with valuations, whether surpluses should be accounted for or shouldn't be accounted for. So something that actually, in terms of day-to-day funds and day-to-day operation of the academy, of your trust, really doesn't have a lot of value or importance, but still something you have to report on as auditors. And then the final 6%, sorry we're closed, that was essentially, again, it was an emphasis on matter around going concern, but it was because the trust was closing. Schools were being rebrokered, or it was a single academy trust moving into another trust. So it's kind of a bit of a technical. So that was roughly about 10% of that 99%. In terms of regularity, so the other key part of our audit is the regularity statement, the funds being used for purposes intended. So there, it's actually the 7.5%, it's not 7.5% were fine, 7.5% were modified regularity reports, so regularity exceptions being noted in our reports. And the top three themes were about 26%. So that's, sorry, just to clarify, that 7.5%, was about 180 trusts had modified regularity reports, and the total number of exceptional issues was about 250, so it's roughly about 1.3 per trust. So most of those trusts had at least one issue. In terms of the types of issues, around about 25% was relating to essentially management accounts, lack of producing management accounts, lack of sharing those with boards of trustees regularly. Maybe the management accounts not including everything that they need to. So just a lack of rigour around that sort of internal financial reporting. 21% was relating to related party transactions, and I'll talk about related parties quite a few times this morning, and have quite a few conversations yesterday about them. So it's a common issue, and the issue that was there was lack of reporting of related party transactions to the SFA, not getting pre-approval for certain related party transactions, and not complying with all of the elements under the handbook around ensuring they're at cost as well. Those were generally the issues. And then the final sort of major area was around internal audit, internal scrutiny. And the issues there were trusts not having any internal scrutiny done in the year, or not really having any kind of adequate internal scrutiny, so maybe a little bit weak or flaky, and that is an area that the SFA focused on as well. So that was the outcomes coming out of the regularity work. So in terms of thinking ahead to the year end, I think for me the key things is obviously around ensuring those the processes around management accounts are robust. You are producing them, sharing them with trustees, reporting related party transactions. I'll come on to talk about RPTs a bit more, but just being aware of what are the requirements, what is the guidance around related party transactions, because there's a lot of misconceptions around them. And then internal scrutiny, making sure that you have got internal scrutiny program and that it is being driven by audit committee. It's not just, I guess, yourselves making that decision, but audit committee are really invested in the decision of what internal scrutiny does. Next area I wanted to cover was just this year's accounts direction, and really I just want to look at what are some of the real key new areas. Obviously, we deal with a lot of the accounts direction in putting the accounts together for you and asking you for the information that you'll need to put those accounts together, but just a couple of real sort of key things to flag. So the first is some of the changes. I've put these into two sections. One's that is coming around the trustees report, governance statement, and regularity, accounting officer's regularity statement. So the first one is, which is your left-hand smiley faces and cross faces. So that's the ESFA's feedback. So a useful section. They've included a few years now, but they provide some feedback to the sector on common issues that they see in, particularly in trustees' reports and accounts in previous years. I won't steal too much of Glenn's thunder because he's going to talk about this later. But some of the key things, the key messages out of this is really about boilerplating of trustees' reports. It's important that the trustees' report does really reflect the circumstances of your trust. And within that is around, particularly around internal scrutiny. I think, and we see that when we come to review the trustees' report, it's often what you're outlining in the governance statement around the internal scrutiny that's being done in the year or the outcome actually is quite different to what you've had done or what's being done. And that's an area that the ESFA pick up on. The other key change, and this is probably the biggest element, is around internal controls. So there's now a new requirement within the governance statement. At the very end of the governance statement, in previous years, there's this statement about review effectiveness, that based on the work of the internal auditor, external auditor, inquiry of the senior management team, there's an effective control environment in place. You now actually have to make a statement, have to actually make a conclusion that based on all those inquiries and inquiries of the audit committee and advice of the audit committee, that you are satisfied that there is an effective governance and risk management and control process in place. It has to actually be a positive conclusion that you are satisfied that there's an appropriate internal control environment. If there isn't, if you can't make that conclusion or statement, you have to state why that's the case and what is the implementation plan that you're making around that. So the sorts of things that are going to inform that conclusion is internal scrutiny program and outcomes for the year, potentially our audit, if that's identifying any sort of significant internal control issues, or just other factors, perhaps SRMA reviews, your school resource management self-assessment outcomes, if there's been any warning notices or sort of intervention or action or communication with the SFA, that's going to inform that conclusion. So again, it's going to be important that that conclusion is supported, but also that actually it's not just something that trustees, forgive me if I'm being rude, I'm a trustee myself, but are just signing off at the end. It has to be a conscious decision to review that conclusion. The other area that's a little bit different is Inspector Gadget, that's the accounting officer. So there's some a useful list now within the AAD, which is around just what information the accounting officer is expected to review, or what processes, controls that they can look at and examine to satisfy themselves to be able to sign that regularity proprietary compliance statement. It's things like reviewing board minutes, reviewing results of SRMA reviews, schools resource management, self-assessment, internal audit, external audit work. Main change this year is that it also cross-references any external reviews or information, so like perhaps SRMA reviews or any other sort of ESFA reviews or investigation, again, informing that review. And I think the key message there is shouldn't just be relying on where our audit, our regularity engagement, it should be reviewing that information. So I think it's something important to share with the accounting officer and make sure that they look at that list and can take on board what's included in there and have reviewed that information themselves. So that was trustees' report, governance statement. In terms of the accounts, nothing too much actually. The main things were there are, left-hand side is around staff costs. A little bit of extra disclosure that has to go into staff costs this year, which is really around other benefits. So it's normally salaries, wages, pensions, national insurance. It must include other benefits provided to staff. So it's something we'll be asking for as part of the audit, but things like medical care, private medical care, housing, cars, any other benefits, the value of that has to be separately disclosed in that note. There's a little more guidance around property valuations. So this will be particularly relevant if you've got new schools coming into the trust, either as converters or as transfers from single academies or other trusts. There's just some guidance there around what are some of the appropriate bases to look at how you value land and buildings, what are some of the options. And also, I think the slight change this year is essentially an emphasis that as the trust receiving a school, particularly coming in from another academy, another trust, that although they might have a value for land and buildings from their previous accounts, previous audit, it's your responsibility, it's the trust's responsibility to assess, is that an appropriate value? So again, nothing that really adds a lot of value to school activity, end of year funds, but something that's in the accounts. We do have to audit it, we do have to look at it. There's a little bit more clarification around local government pension schemes, and here it was really around where local government pension schemes have got surpluses or assets at the end of the day. We saw a lot more of those last year, expecting to continue to see more again this year. So the key thing there is about if you're going to not recognise the surplus in the scheme, or perhaps recognise the surplus in the scheme in the accounts, that there is adequate sort of reference disclosure in the accounts about why you're recognising or not recognising, because often that was missing in last year's accounts, and that's what the SFA picked up on. There's a lot of disparity of treatment across the sector around pension surpluses. The SFA are aware of it. They are working. There's a joint sort of ESFA local government pension scheme. I think our institute is involved in it, trying to provide a bit more guidance about local government pension schemes and recognition of deficits. Again, a bit of a misleading, not misleading, I'll say bold, useless figure in the accounts because it's all an accounting estimate, but again, it's an important part of the accounts. The last bit is just around agency arrangements. And agency arrangements. So there, it's really just the key thing there is you've always had to disclose agency income expenditure. It's now, and a lot of trusts do this, you do have to disclose any unspent balances of agency funds at the end of the year. And just to remember, there's obviously time limits around some of those agency funds. Right, the new handbook. What's going to be in there? Absolutely no idea. Just my idea of what some things that might be in there, just because of some of the new publications that have come through the year. So there was a publication earlier in March about leasing agreements, changes to leasing arrangements. So trusts can't enter into finance leases without the SFA approval. The SFA won't grant approval, so a bit pointless. There is some new guidance that from 1st September, trusts can enter into finance leases in certain circumstances. So things like catering equipment, sports equipment, IT equipment, telephones, groundkeeping equipment. The guidance provides a reasonably comprehensive list. So for those items, consent is now automatic. You don't have to get consent from the DfE. If you're going to lease something that's on that list, you can enter into a finance lease. And existing leases for those items pre-1st September also now have automatic consent. So I expect that will be embodied into the handbook. There's a new Academy Trust Governance Guide. Now, this just sort of replaces the old 2019 Governance Handbook. It hasn't changed any of the requirements. It's built on the new trust sort of quality descriptors that were published in sort of 2023. So it's not new, there's no new elements, but it's just a kind of a refresh, and it's more aligned to the speak and the terminology in the handbook. So again, I'd expect that the handbook will be updated, obviously, to reflect some of that, tie in the same sort of language and cross-reference. The other two areas, I think there could be some tightening around is just because I've seen it in the press, central charges, gag pooling. There's been a few issues with schools, striking about levels of central charges, levels of reserves being retained centrally, and gag pooling. So it might be something that there's not necessarily tightening, maybe some clearer guidance, might be some more tightening on that. So I just think that's an area that we might see something about. Related party transactions, really just, so I'll talk a bit about it a bit more. This is an area we see quite a few issues in, and so I really just wanted to emphasise a couple of key things here. All related party transactions have to be reported to the SFA. It doesn't matter if they're with the diocese or a sponsor, whether they're for 50 quid, any related party transaction, it has to be reported to the SFA. There's also a level of having to get pre-approval. Now the threshold for that has increased. It's now £40,000 for any sort of, per sort of contract value or agreement. So that's a lot increase, a bit more flexibility. The exemption, there are exemptions from the pre-approval, and I think this is where trusts get confused, that they think the exemption from pre-approval is exemption from reporting. It's not. All related party transactions have to be reported. The exemption is just around pre-approval. And that's if you're a college, university, sponsor. And the other key one is, I know there's quite a few sort of faith trusts here, so any transactions with the diocese, again, those, if they're relating to the religious ethos and character of a trust, those are exempt from the pre-approval, not from reporting. They still have to be reported. Does that all make sense? A couple of really quick last minute or two, some other updates and good to knows that have been sort of come out over the last year. There's an Academy Trust Governance Code. Is anyone aware of this coming out? So several years ago, it was something that came out through the charity sector, a charity governance code. So it's a voluntary document, it's not mandatory, and it was produced to encourage charities to have strong, effective governance. Now I know we have the governance guide that I mentioned earlier, posted in the governance handbook, but this is something that's been done by Confederation of School Trusts and working with other providers, producing this voluntary code. So it's very similar to the charity one. What's the idea around it is, well, essentially to use it, it's built on a fundamental principle and then 7 other key principles. So how it was adopted in the charity world was charities were encouraged to work through those principles, kind of self-assess where are we now against those principles in terms of our governance as a board of trustees. You know, are we complying? What are the areas that we're not complying or we need to develop, and draw up a plan for that? And then it was encouraged to sort of disclose that in the trustees report. And that's essentially the same idea here. So it's something that can sort of overlay with that governance guide, and it's a good document. It's a good thing if trustees aren't aware of. It's something to raise at board levels and to look at and assess how do we comply with this code. And then just some good practice guides, a couple of good practice guides updated in the year. One on Academy Trust reserves, what are they, how to set them, how to use them. Sort of helpful. One around internal scrutiny, internal audit, some best practice, how to approach that, and importance of your audit committee driving it. One around local government pension schemes, that doesn't just tells you a lot about what is local government pension schemes, you all know, but a little bit about accounting for deficits and things. And then coming soon is one on related party transactions, which I think will be really valuable. I have seen a draft of it, but I can't divulge any information. But it's hopefully something that will provide some more guidance. And that's it. That was kind of a bit of a whistle stop of some of the key changes for this year.